Style D, atmospheric plus watching obsession. I didn't know his name yet. I only knew the silence he carried into a room, the way conversations died when he passed, the way grown men suddenly found their shoes interesting. I kept kneading. I had flour on my wrists and a child in my belly that the world didn't know about yet. And I had decided, somewhere between the third sleepless night and the first morning of sickness, that nothing, not debt, not fear, not a man in a dark coat standing in my doorway, would stop my hands from working. He watched me for 4 minutes before he said a word. I counted them. I had started counting things since he left: minutes, lira, heartbeats, reasons to keep going. When the man in the doorway finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that I had to stop breathing to hear it. "You didn't look up," he said. I didn't, even then. That was the first mistake I made with Dante, Morty. It would not be the last. The bell above the door didn't ring the way it usually did. It was more like the silence arrived first, and the bell was an afterthought. I felt it before I heard it, that specific stillness that settles over a room when something has changed in the air. The regulars at the corner table stopped mid-sentence. Old Giuseppe set down his espresso without finishing the sip he'd already started. Even the radio, tuned permanently to a station that played nothing but 1980s ballads, seemed to lower itself. I had flour to my elbows and dough beneath my palms, and I did not stop. I had learned in the last 6 months that there were 2 kinds of problems in this world: the ones you could fix by stopping what you were doing, and the ones that got worse the moment you gave them your attention. My mother used to say that to me when I was small and frightened of thunderstorms. "Don't look up, Valentina. The sky doesn't care if you're watching," so I didn't look up. I pressed my palm into the dough, folded it, turned it, pressed again. The rhythm was the only thing keeping my hands from shaking, and my hands could not afford to shake. Not now. Not with what was growing inside me, 3 months along and already changing the way my body moved through the world. "You didn't look up." The voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had never once needed to repeat itself. I looked up then. I had to. Ignoring him a second time would have been its own kind of statement, and I wasn't foolish enough to make statements to a man dressed like that, standing like that, with 2 others flanking the door like furniture that happened to breathe. He was younger than I expected. Mid-30s, maybe, dark hair pushed back like he hadn't thought about it in days, a coat that cost more than I made in a year, worn like it weighed nothing. But it was his eyes that made the back of my neck go cold, not cruel, not even unkind. Just utterly, completely still, like a lake with something enormous moving beneath the surface. "Should I have?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Something flickered behind his stillness. Not quite a smile. "Everyone else does. I have bread that won't proof itself." Giuseppe, 3 tables away, made a sound like he was choking on his own espresso. The man, and I would learn his name was Dante only later, would learn what that name meant in this city only later still, tilted his head slightly. Studying me the way you'd study a door that wouldn't open with the usual key. "This is your shop. It belonged to my aunt. It's mine now." I didn't say because she died and left me nothing but debt and a lease I can't break. I didn't say because the man who put this baby in me disappeared 11 weeks ago like smoke through a window. There were things you didn't hand to strangers, even when strangers walked into your bakery like they owned the air in it. "Marco Bellini," he said. "Your aunt owed him money." My hand stilled finally on the dough. There it was. The reason for the silence, the reason for the men at the door, the reason my chest had gone tight from the moment the bell hadn't rung properly. My aunt has been dead for 4 months. Debts don't die with people. You'd know that, running a business. I looked at him directly then, really looked, the way I hadn't let myself with anyone in months, because looking at people meant they could see you looking back. And I had nothing left to hide that I wanted found. "How much?" €40,000, I laughed. It surprised both of us, I think, a short, disbelieving sound that came from somewhere low in my chest. "I sell bread. I sell pastries to old men who tip in coins. I don't have €40,000, and neither did my aunt, which is presumably why she's dead and you're standing in my shop instead of hers." One of the men at the door shifted. The kind of shift that meant a hand moving toward something. The man in front of me didn't move at all. He simply held up 2 fingers barely, and the room went still again. Marco Bellini doesn't forgive debts, he said. He transfers them. To family, to property. To whatever's left standing. Then I suppose he'll have to take a bakery that's 3 months behind on rent and a woman who hasn't slept properly since spring. I went back to the dough. My hands were shaking now, but I kept them moving anyway, because stopping would have meant looking up again, and I had used up my courage for the day. Why are you not afraid of me? I did look up at that, because it was a strange question, asked by a strange man, in a voice that genuinely seemed to want the answer. I didn't say I wasn't. You haven't stopped working. If I stop every time something terrifies me, I said, I will never get anything done. There's quite a lot that terrifies me these days. He was quiet for a long moment. Behind him, through the window, I could see Milan moving on, indifferent, a bus, a woman with a stroller, 2 boys racing bicycles down the wet street. None of them knew that in here, something had just shifted, the way weather shifts before you feel the first drop of rain. Farina, he said finally. That's not my name. It's what's on your hands. He turned then, and the 2 men at the door peeled back like a curtain to let him through, and just as quickly as the silence had come. It broke, Giuseppe exhaled. The radio seemed to find its volume again. The bell above the door rang properly this time as he left. I did not know, standing there with flour on my wrists and my heart slamming against my ribs, that I had just survived the only conversation that would matter for the next year of my life. I only knew that I needed to sit down, and that the baby chose that exact moment to remind me, with a small and impossible flutter, that she was still there. Still mine. Still something worth protecting, no matter what walked through that door next. The bell did not ring again that day. But I understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in the worst moments, that it would. 3 months before the bell didn't ring properly, my life had looked entirely different. I had a fiancé. I had a lease that wasn't yet underwater. I had a small, foolish dream of a bakery with my name above the door instead of my aunt's. And a man named Tomas who kissed my forehead every morning before he left for work. Work he never described in any detail I could repeat to anyone. Work that paid for a watch he wore but never explained. I had been the kind of foolish that only happens to women who want, very badly, to believe in something. Tomas disappeared on a Tuesday. Not dramatically, no note, no slammed door, no final fight to remember him by. He simply didn't come home, and his phone went to a voicemail that filled up within a week and was never checked again. And after 11 days, I stopped setting a second plate at dinner. Because some part of me had already understood what the rest of me refused to say out loud. I found out about the baby 4 days after that. There is a specific kind of loneliness in standing in a pharmacy bathroom with a plastic stick in your hand, doing math you don't want to do, while the man responsible for half the equation has made himself into a ghost. I told no one, not my mother, 3 hours away and already worried sick about money. Not Giuseppe, who would have wept and then told the entire neighborhood within the hour out of pure affection. I told the dough, I told the ovens. I baked at 4 in the morning because sleep had become a country I couldn't find the border to, and somewhere in the rhythm of folding and proofing and shaping, I found enough quiet to survive the days. That was where Marco was sitting at the corner table where Giuseppe usually claimed his espresso, except it was 9 at night and the shop was closed and the door had somehow opened anyway. You should lock that better, he said, not looking up from the toothpick he was working between his teeth. I had flour in my hair and exhaustion behind my eyes, and absolutely no patience left for men who let themselves into closed shops. Who are you? The man whose 40,000 euro you're currently failing to pay. He smiled, and it was an unpleasant thing, all teeth and no warmth. Nothing like the stillness of the man from that afternoon. Dante didn't tell you my name? Interesting, he usually likes things very clear. So this was Bellini, the debt itself made flesh, sitting in my dead aunt's chair. I don't have your money. I know. He stood, unhurried, the way men do when they've already decided the room belongs to them. Which is why we're going to discuss other arrangements. I won't recount everything he said. Some of it doesn't deserve to be repeated, even now, even safe. but I will say that he stepped closer than any stranger should, that he touched the strap of my apron like he was deciding whether it was worth keeping. That I backed against the counter with the rolling pin still in my hand and understood, with the cold clarity that pregnancy seems to sharpen rather than dull, that I would use it if I had to. "There she is," he said softly, watching something in my face. "There's the fight in her." The bell rang. This time it rang exactly the way it was supposed to, clean and bright. And Dante Morty stood in the doorway with an expression that hadn't moved an inch since the afternoon. Except that something underneath it had gone very, very quiet in a way that made the air feel 10 degrees colder. Marco, just the name, nothing else, but Bellini's hand left my apron strap like it had been burned. "Dante. I didn't realize you had personal interest in collections. I have interest in my territory. This shop is 3 blocks inside it." Dante hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved more than a step into the room. "You're collecting outside your lines again. The debt's mine. Her aunt borrowed from me directly. Then you'll collect from her aunt's estate. Through the proper channels. Not by letting yourself into a locked shop at 9 at night to discuss arrangements with a woman who's clearly told you no." Something passed between the two men that had nothing to do with me, old. Complicated, the kind of history that lives in cities like a second skin under the first. Bellini left without another word to me, brushing past Dante close enough to be a small act of defiance, and the bell rang twice more before the shop was quiet again. "You should lock your door better," Dante said, echoing Bellini's own words without seeming to notice the irony, or perhaps noticing it perfectly and choosing it on purpose. "I'll add it to the list of things I should do better." He looked at me for a long moment, the rolling pin still gripped white-knuckled in my hand, the flower. The exhaustion I couldn't hide even if I'd wanted to. "He'll come back, I know. I'll make sure he doesn't." "Why?" I set the rolling pin down finally. Because my arm had started to ache, and because some instinct told me I didn't need it anymore tonight. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." "No," he agreed, and there was something almost like surprise in his own voice, like he was discovering the answer as he gave it. "I don't," he left without explaining further. I locked the door behind him, properly, this time, and sat alone in my dark shop with my hand pressed against the small, stubborn curve of my stomach, and thought about a man who left without a goodbye, and a man who arrived without being asked, and how strange it was that the second one frightened me less than the first one's absence did. I didn't know yet that the man who'd vanished and the man standing in my doorway shared more than a city. I wouldn't know for weeks. But something in the back of my mind, some small, unplaced detail, had already begun quietly to itch. I learned who Dante Morty was the way most people in Milan learned things they wished they hadn't. In pieces, from people who lowered their voices halfway through telling you. Giuseppe told me first, the morning after, his hands wrapped around his espresso like it was the only solid thing in the room. "You don't shout at the Morty family, Valentina. You don't argue with them. You especially don't almost hit one with a rolling pin." I didn't hit him, I was going to hit Bellini. Bellini works for the Morty family. Giuseppe crossed himself, an old habit that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with fear. Or he did, until apparently he decided your aunt's debt was his own private hunting ground. That's not a small thing, what Dante did last night. That's a man drawing a line in front of half the city. I hadn't understood then how large a line it was. I understood better over the following days, watching the way people in the neighborhood began to treat my shop, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of careful deference. As though the building itself had been marked with something invisible and important. I understood best when Dante returned 3 days later, alone this time, no men at the door, and sat in the same corner chair Bellini had occupied, looking entirely too large for the small wooden frame of it. "You run this place by yourself," he said, not a question. "My aunt's recipes, my hands, yes. The bread yesterday. The one with rosemary. You were watching the shop." It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't far from one either. "I was watching the street." He said it simply, without apology, as though watching streets was simply something men like him did, the way other men checked the weather. "Your bread sold out in 2 hours. The woman before you couldn't keep that loaf on the shelf past noon, and she'd been baking it 20 years. My aunt's recipe. My adjustments. I wiped my hands on my apron, more from nerves than necessity. I use less yeast, more time. Patience instead of shortcuts. Something in his expression shifted, not quite warmth, but interest, sharp and genuine. You could teach that, patience instead of shortcuts. I could. Few people want to learn it. Patience doesn't sell as well as speed. No, he agreed, and there was something underneath the word that suggested he was thinking of someone, entirely unrelated to bread. I learned, in pieces over the following weeks, the shape of what surrounded him. The Morty family controlled 6 districts of Milan with the kind of quiet efficiency that meant most people never noticed they were being controlled at all. No overt violence, no public displays. Just an absolute, unspoken understanding of whose permission mattered. Dante had taken over 4 years prior, after his father's death, and had spent every year since consolidating something his father had let grow soft at the edges. He had a brother once. I learned that from Giuseppe too, delivered in the lowest voice yet, the kind reserved for things that still drew blood when spoken aloud. Younger brother, Sandro. Disappeared maybe 2 years back. Some say dead, some say he ran, nobody says which to Dante's face. I filed that away without understanding why it mattered. The way you file away a stranger's grief, with sympathy, but at a distance. The threat arrived on a Thursday, in the shape of a brick through my front window, wrapped with a note that simply read, "Bellini doesn't forget." I was sweeping glass when Dante arrived, faster than I'd seen him move before, 2 of his men already fanning out into the street behind him like they'd been deployed rather than walking. "Are you hurt?" "No, it happened before I opened. I found it like this." My hands were shaking now, properly shaking, glass crunching under my shoes as I tried to clear it before customers arrived. "I can't afford a new window, Dante. I can't afford the rent I already owe. I cannot do this." He crouched, careful of the glass, and picked up the brick himself, reading the note with an expression that had gone somewhere very cold and very far away. "You won't need to afford it," he said. "I don't want charity. It isn't charity." He stood, and for the first time, I saw something close to fury beneath his stillness, banked, controlled, but unmistakably there. "This is mine to answer. Bellini broke a window inside my territory to send a message to me, not to you. You're simply standing where the message landed. That's not better." "No," he admitted. "It isn't." He paid for the window before I could argue further, sent a man within the hour, glass replaced by evening, no invoice, no conversation about repayment. And though I told myself it changed nothing, told myself I was still simply a woman standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, I noticed that night. Baking bread no one had ordered because my hands needed something to do, that I had stopped flinching when the bell rang. That perhaps should have frightened me more than the brick had. The attack came 2 weeks later, on a night thick with the kind of rain that turns Milan streets into rivers of reflected light. I was closing alone, later than I should have been, the kind of late that happens when grief and exhaustion make you forget your own rules about safety. The bell rang as I was locking the register, and I turned expecting Dante, who had taken to appearing most evenings now with no explanation beyond checking the territory. A phrase we had both stopped pretending was entirely true. It wasn't Dante. It was 2 men I didn't recognize, and the look on their faces told me everything I needed to know before either of them spoke a word. I don't remember deciding to run. I remember the back door, the alley, the rain soaking through my dress within seconds. The particular terror of running while pregnant, that instinct to protect a body that suddenly contained 2 heartbeats instead of 1. I remember a hand closing around my arm, rough, and the scream that tore out of me before I could stop it. I remember Dante arriving like the rain itself had summoned him. What happened next, I understood mostly in fragments. The sound of something breaking that wasn't glass, a man's cry cut short. The particular silence that follows violence when it's over rather than building. When I could see clearly again, 1 man was on the ground and not moving in a way that made my stomach turn, and the other was being held against the wet brick wall by a hand at his throat. and Dante's voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear it over the rain. "Who sent you?" "Bellini. Bellini doesn't have the men or the money to go against me directly." "Who sent you?" The man said nothing further, and Dante did something then that I won't describe in detail, except to say that I looked away, and that when I looked back. The man was talking very quickly, and what he said made Dante's entire body go still in a way that was somehow more frightening than the violence had been. "It's done," Dante said finally, releasing him. "Go tell whoever sent you that the message arrived." He turned to me then, and whatever fury had lived in him moments before dissolved into something raw and unguarded. Something I hadn't yet seen on his face. He crossed the alley in 2 strides, and his hands found my face, my arms, checking for injury with a desperation that had nothing controlled about it at all. "Are you hurt, Valentina? Are you hurt?" It was the first time he'd used my actual name. "I'm fine. I'm fine, The adrenaline broke all at once, and I started shaking so violently I couldn't finish the sentence, and he pulled me against his chest without asking. One hand splayed protectively low across my back, over the place where I carried what neither of us had spoken aloud yet. "You're pregnant," he said, not a question. He must have felt it somehow in the shape of me against him. 3 months. Almost 4. The words came out before I could stop them, exhaustion and fear stripping away every wall I'd built. His name was Tomas. He disappeared in March. I don't know where he went or why, I just know he left, and I'm raising this baby alone, and I am so tired of being afraid, Dante, I am so. "Tomas," he repeated very quietly. And something in his face had gone strange and distant, like a door opening onto a room he hadn't entered in years. What did he look like? I described him: dark hair, a scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, a particular way of going quiet before he lied. I watched Dante's expression as I spoke and didn't understand, not yet, why each detail seemed to land like a small blow. He didn't tell me why that night. He simply held me in the rain until I stopped shaking, walked me back to my flat above the shop, and sat outside my door until morning, though I didn't know that until I found him there at dawn. Still and silent, eyes red from a sleeplessness that had nothing to do with watching the street. The fast mystery, who had sent men to take me, why Bellini's threats had escalated into something with real teeth, closed that night, in fragments delivered between violence and rain. Bellini had borrowed against my aunt's debt to fund a war he was losing, and taking me, hurting me, had become his last desperate leverage against Dante's territory. But a second mystery had opened in its place, quieter and stranger, living in the way Dante had gone still at the mention of a scarred eyebrow and a man named Tomas. In the question he hadn't asked yet, and clearly didn't know how to. He didn't ask about Tomas again for 4 days. I noticed the absence of the question the way you notice a held breath, present in every conversation we didn't have, heavier with each hour it went unspoken. I should explain something about myself in those days. I had built, brick by careful brick, a version of my life that didn't require anyone's help. I had refused offers from neighbors, refused my mother's worried suggestions that I come home, refused, for as long as I possibly could, the growing. Undeniable fact that Dante Morti had begun arranging his evenings around the hour my shop closed. I surprised him, I think, on the 5th day, when Bellini's remaining men tried something smaller and stupider, an attempt to firebomb the shop's storage room. Foiled only because I'd smelled the gasoline before the match struck, and had already emptied half the flour sacks onto the threat before his men arrived to finish the job. "You put it out yourself," he said, standing in the wreckage of my storage room, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, not concern, not relief, but something closer to astonishment. I wasn't going to stand outside and wait to be rescued. Most people would have run. Most people don't have a business that's the only thing standing between them and complete ruin. I wiped soot from my hands that had, until recently, only ever touched flour and dough. I've been underestimated my entire life, Dante. I'm rather tired of it. Something shifted in him then. I watched it happen, watched the careful architecture of his control loosen by some small but visible degree. Your skill. The patience you mentioned, where did you learn it? My mother, her mother before that. I hesitated, then added something I hadn't told him yet, hadn't told almost anyone. And from someone who left. Tomas used to say I was wasting it on bread, said I should be doing something that paid better, mattered more. I laughed without much humor in it. He had a particular way of making everything I loved sound small. What else do you remember about him? His voice had gone very careful, very deliberate. He had this scar? I traced a line above my own eyebrow, mirroring the memory. From falling off a bicycle as a boy, he said, and he never could sit with his back to a door. Always had to face the room. I thought it was charming once. Later I understood it meant something else. Dante had gone completely still. The particular stillness I'd learned meant something enormous was happening beneath his surface. What was his full name? Tomas Russo. Why does it? Sandro, he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. My brother's name was Alessandro. We called him Sandro. His jaw tightened, something old and grieving moving across features that had been carved into permanent control for so long I'd forgotten he might still be capable of breaking. He disappeared 2 years ago. We thought he was dead. We thought Bellini's people had killed him in the territory disputes. The room went very cold and very small around me. That's not possible, I said, though some treacherous part of my mind was already assembling the pieces, the timing, the disappearance. The particular way Tomas had always avoided certain neighborhoods, certain names, certain conversations about his family. Russo, Dante said slowly, was our mother's maiden name. I sat down very suddenly on an overturned flour sack. The room tilting in a way that had nothing to do with the smoke, still hanging in the air. The man who had left me alone and pregnant, the man whose disappearance had nearly destroyed me, was not simply a coward who'd run from responsibility. He was Dante's brother. Irony point 2, resolved. The listener has likely already suspected this from the scar detail. Valentina herself is only now understanding it. He's alive, I said, the words strange in my mouth. If this is true, he's alive somewhere. Or he's dead, and someone is using his name and his face to hide something. Dante's hands had curled into fists at his sides. The only outward sign of the storm I sensed building underneath. Either way, this changes everything, Valentina. If Sandro left you carrying his child and Bellini somehow knows it, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I understood, with the particular cold clarity pregnancy seemed to sharpen in me, that I was no longer simply a woman who'd been unlucky enough to inherit her aunt's debts. I was, suddenly and impossibly, a piece on a board far larger than I'd understood, carrying inside me a child who might be the missing heir to a war neither side had finished fighting. Bellini's final move came 3 nights later, and it came for blood. I understood, in the moment the first shot shattered my front window, not a brick this time, but a bullet. Close enough that I felt the air move past my cheek, that everything before this had been a kind of negotiation. This was no longer that. Dante had insisted on staying that evening, some instinct in him refusing to leave despite my protests that I needed at least the illusion of a normal life. I would spend the rest of my days grateful for that instinct. He moved before I'd fully registered the danger, his body between me and the window before the second shot came. And what followed was something I can only describe as a transformation, not into something inhuman, exactly, but into something that had clearly always lived beneath the careful, controlled man I'd come to know, finally given permission to surface. He was magnificent and terrible in equal measure. I watched him disarm a man twice his size with an economy of motion that suggested decades of practice, watched him put himself in the path of violence meant for me without a flicker of hesitation. Watched the particular fury in his face when one of Bellini's men got close enough to grab my wrist, a fury that ended, decisively and permanently, any further threat from that man. When it was over, when the last of Bellini's people had fled or fallen, Dante turned to me with blood on his knuckles, and something raw and unguarded in his eyes that I'd never seen him allow anyone to witness. "You didn't run," he said, disbelieving, as though I'd done something genuinely incomprehensible. "Where would I run? You were standing in front of the only door. You should have tried anyway." "Most people try anyway." I told you once, I said quietly, my hands still shaking, my heart still slamming against my ribs. I'm tired of being someone who runs. He crossed the small space between us and his hands, found my face the way they had in the rain, except this time there was no urgency of injury to check. Only the simple, devastating fact of two people standing very close together with nothing left between them but the truth. Farina, he said, and the name that had once been cold, observational, came out now like something closer to prayer. The first day I saw you, you didn't look up. Do you know how long it's been since someone in my world hasn't looked up at me? I had bread to bake. You had every reason to be afraid, and instead you simply continued. I've thought about that more than I should admit. His thumb traced along my cheekbone, careful, like he was memorizing something. I came back the second day telling myself it was about the debt. I came back the third day telling myself it was about territory. I'm done lying to myself about why I keep coming back, Valentina. Why her referenced Dante admits it to himself. What happened next was slow and careful. And nothing like the desperate violence that had filled the room moments before. When he finally kissed me, it was with a gentleness that seemed to cost him something enormous to maintain, restraint built on top of restraint. A man who had stopped himself, I would learn later. 3 separate times that week before allowing himself this one. I felt the particular flutter of the baby between us, as though she too understood that something had shifted permanently in the architecture of my life, and Dante pulled back at the sensation. His hand finding the curve of my stomach with an expression of wonder that had no business existing on the face of a man who, 20 minutes earlier, had ended a man's life to protect me. This changes things, he said softly. If this child is Sandro's, then this child is your family too, I finished, understanding the weight of it even as I said it. Whether either of us wanted that or not, he didn't answer with words. He simply pressed his forehead against mine, breathing slowly, and somewhere in the wreckage of my shattered front window. With broken glass still scattered across the floor and the night air pouring in cold around us, I understood that whatever safety I had left now lived entirely in this man's hands, and that I had, somewhere in the past month, stopped being afraid of that fact. The war isn't over, he said finally. I know, it's only just beginning. He was right. But for one suspended moment, with his hand resting protectively over the child neither of us yet understood, I let myself believe that whatever came next, we would face it as something other than strangers. War, it turns out, does not announce itself with a single dramatic battle. It arrives in 100 small cruelties, each one designed to remind you exactly what you stand to lose. Bellini, cornered and increasingly desperate, abandoned subtlety entirely. Within a week, 2 of Dante's men were dead. One of them a quiet, kind soul named Paolo who'd taken to bringing me extra flour from his cousin's mill, who had laughed, genuinely laughed. Every time my comedy relief friend Bep told one of his disastrous dating stories at the corner table. Paolo's death broke something in the shop's daily rhythm that I hadn't realized I'd come to depend on. Bep took it hardest of anyone. He'd known Paolo since childhood, had been midway through convincing him to finally ask out the florist 3 doors down. A romantic campaign that had provided more entertainment in my shop than anything in recent memory. The morning after Paolo's death, Bep sat in his usual corner chair and didn't make a single joke, didn't mention his ongoing disastrous diet, didn't complain about his terror of the dentist's office. He had appointments at every 6 months. He simply sat with his coffee going cold, and I understood that grief, even in this strange and violent world, looked the same as it did everywhere else. Then the message arrived for me directly, not a brick, not a bullet, but a photograph slipped under my door of my own mother's house, 3 hours away, with a single word written on the back: soon. I drove to Dante's home that night without calling ahead, finding him in a study lined with books he likely never had time to read, and I put the photograph on his desk with hands that had finally, after everything, stopped shaking out of fear and started shaking out of something closer to fury. He's threatening my mother now. I know, I have men there already. Dante's expression was carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that meant he was holding something back to protect me. Valentina, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually consider it rather than simply refusing out of pride. Ask. Leave Milan. Take your mother somewhere safe, somewhere with no connection to me or to this war, and stay there until it's finished. He held my gaze steadily. I will send you everything you need. You will never have to worry about money or safety again. This is not me trying to control your choices. This is me asking you to survive. I understood, standing in that study, that this was the real exit point, the moment where I could genuinely leave. Where staying was no longer something forced upon me by circumstance, but something I would have to actively choose, eyes open, full knowledge of every cost involved. I thought about the baby. I thought about Paolo, dead for the crime of bringing me flour. I thought about my mother's house, photographed by men who wanted to remind me how easily everything could be taken. I thought about who I would become if I stayed in this world permanently. Whether the woman who'd once simply wanted a bakery with her name above the door could survive becoming someone who lived. Always one step from violence. If I leave, I said slowly, what happens to you? I finish what Bellini started. I end this. One way or another. And if I'm not here to see how it ends, then at least you'll be alive to raise that child somewhere it never has to learn what a gunshot sounds like. I sat down across from him, my hand resting on the small curve of my stomach, and made a decision that I knew, even as I made it, would cost me something real, not my safety, which I had already half surrendered. But something quieter and harder to name. The version of myself who could pretend, even briefly, that she was simply an innocent bystander in someone else's war. I'm not leaving, I said, not because I'm not afraid. I am afraid every single day. But I watched you become something terrible to protect me, and I am not going to repay that by running while you face the consequences alone. This child is going to be born into your world, whether I'm standing beside you or 3 hours away, pretending I'm not part of it. I would rather she know her mother chose to stay. Dante closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, there was something in his expression that looked almost like grief, mixed with something fiercer and more grateful than I'd seen from him yet. You understand what staying means, what it might cost you. I do. I'm choosing it anyway. He came around the desk and knelt in front of my chair, his hands finding mine. His forehead pressed briefly against my knuckles, in a gesture more vulnerable than anything else he'd shown me. Then we finished this together. The choice had cost me exactly what I'd known it would, the last comfortable illusion that I was separate from this world, that I could still, somehow, walk away clean. I would carry that cost for the rest of my life. I have never once regretted paying it. They took me on a Tuesday, the same day of the week Tomas, Sandro, had disappeared 2 years before. A coincidence that felt, in the moment, like the universe twisting a particularly cruel knife. I had gone to the market alone, against every instinction Dante's men had drilled into me over the past weeks, because I had needed 1 hour that felt like my old life. I should have known better. I have spent every day since reminding myself that hindsight is a luxury survival doesn't always afford you in the moment. The men who took me were professional, quick, efficient in a way that told me Bellini had finally spent the money he didn't have on people who actually knew what they were doing. I fought. I want that understood clearly. I fought with everything a pregnant woman with no training could manage, clawed and bit and screamed until a chemical-soaked cloth ended the fight for me. I woke in a cold room with concrete walls and a single bulb, my hands bound in front of me rather than behind. A small mercy I would understand later. That allowed me to keep one protective arm curved instinctively over my stomach, even unconscious. Bellini visited twice. The first time, he simply looked at me with an expression of satisfaction that made my skin crawl, said nothing of substance, and left. The second time, he brought someone with him, and the sight of that second man's face broke something in me that I hadn't expected to break. It was Carlo, Dante's cousin, a man who'd sat at family dinners, who I'd seen laugh with Dante over old stories, who had brought me a gift for the baby just 2 weeks prior. A small knitted blanket from his wife. "You're surprised," Carlo said, not unkindly, settling into the room's only chair. "Don't be. Bellini pays better than blood in the end. Dante's father passed me over for territory twice. A man gets tired of being loyal to people who don't see his worth. Slow mystery resolved. This was the traitor, the reason Bellini had always seemed to know precisely where to strike. Precisely when Dante's men would be elsewhere. Precisely how to find a pregnant woman alone at a market, despite a security detail that should have made it impossible. "He'll find me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Eventually, the question is what's left to find." Carlo's expression flickered with something almost like regret, quickly suppressed. "I am sorry it has to be you specifically. You seem like a decent woman. But Dante needs to understand what real loss feels like before this ends, and you happen to be carrying the thing he's decided to care about most." I did not break in that room. I want that stated plainly, without false modesty. I was terrified. I was in pain from the rough handling. I was more frightened for the small life inside me than I had ever been for anything in my own. But I did not give Carlo or Bellini the satisfaction of watching me shatter. Instead, I talked. I asked Carlo questions about his wife, about the blanket she'd knitted, about whether he'd told her yet what he'd become. Small, careful pressure applied exactly where I sensed it might land. I watched guilt work at him like water on stone, slow but relentless, until something in his composure finally cracked. "There's a door," he said finally, refusing to look at me, his voice barely above a whisper. "Service entrance, east side, guarded by only one man after midnight. I'm not telling you this." "You didn't hear this from me." "I didn't hear anything," I agreed. He left without another word, and I spent the following hours working at the rope binding my wrists with a patience I'd learned, ironically, from years of working dough that resisted shaping, slow. Deliberate, refusing to force what could instead be coaxed. By the time Dante's men finally breached the building, alerted, I would learn later, by Carlo himself. In a final act of conscience that cost him everything with Bellini and very nearly his life. I had already worked my hands free and was standing at the door Carlo had described. Ready to run the moment an opportunity presented itself. I had not waited passively to be rescued. I had refused, even in the darkest room of my life, to become someone who simply waited for someone else to save her. His POV. Dante had broken 3 of his father's rules in the hours since Valentina disappeared, and he found he did not care about a single one of them. He had moved against Bellini's remaining holdings without consolidating his own first. He had pulled men from districts that needed them to flood the search for one woman. He had, for the first time in 4 years of careful, calculated leadership, allowed something other than strategy to drive every decision he made. If she was gone, if he was too late, he understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that he would burn the entire city to ash and call it mercy. I was already moving toward the service door when his men breached the building, the sound of violence erupting somewhere above me. Close enough that I dropped low and pressed myself against the cold concrete wall, hands instinctively curved around my stomach. Dante found me there minutes later, and the sound he made upon seeing me, relief and fury, and something that broke entirely open in his chest, was not a sound I had words for, even now. Even with months to consider it. "You're alive." His hands moved over me with the same desperate urgency as the night in the rain, checking for injury, finding the rope marks at my wrists. The bruise forming along my jaw where I'd fought my captors. "You're alive, I freed my own hands," I said, my voice rough but steady. I was nearly at the door. Something in his expression shifted, pride, fierce and unmistakable, cutting through the relief. "Of course you were." Bep appeared moments later, having insisted on joining the search despite having no business whatsoever being anywhere near actual danger. Immediately tripping over a length of loose pipe in a manner so catastrophically clumsy that even in the wreckage of that terrible night, I felt a laugh escape me, sharp and slightly hysterical. But genuine. "I am terrified of basements," Bep announced to no one in particular. Righting himself with as much dignity as he could muster while clutching what appeared to be a fire extinguisher, he had no idea how to operate. "I want that on the record, terrified, and yet here I am." "Here you are," I agreed, my voice cracking between the laugh and something closer to tears. Carlo, Dante said grimly, helping me to my feet with infinite care. He's the one who told us where you were. I told him everything then, the blanket, the regret, the careful information passed in a whisper that had ultimately saved my life. Dante's expression remained carefully neutral, but I understood, in the months that followed, that Carlo's final act of conscience had purchased him something Dante's family rarely granted: mercy. In the form of exile rather than execution. The villain himself, Bellini, finally cornered in the building's upper floor. Surrounded by men who had abandoned him, the moment his own betrayal of Carlo's loyalty became known throughout his organization. Looked, in the end, smaller than the threat he'd represented for months. Desperation does that to men, I think. It shrinks them down to the size of their own fear. This isn't over, Bellini spat, even as Dante's men restrained him. You think this ends because you found her? There are debts older than your father's grave, Morty. Things you don't understand about your own family. Save it, Dante said quietly, and something in his voice made even Bellini fall silent. We'll discuss everything you know. Somewhere private. I didn't ask what happened after that. There are some truths I have chosen, deliberately, not to carry. I know only that Bellini's organization dissolved within the month, that the war that had nearly cost me everything ended not with a single dramatic battle, but with the slow, inevitable collapse of a man who had built his entire power on debts and threats rather than loyalty. What I remember most clearly from that night isn't the violence or the rescue, but the moment afterward, sitting wrapped in a blanket in the back of Dante's car, his hand never leaving mine. When he finally allowed himself to say what he'd clearly been holding back through every careful, controlled action of the rescue. I almost lost you, he said, his voice breaking on the words in a way I'd never heard from him before. Both of you. You didn't, I said softly. I'm here. We're here. But we both understood, in that quiet car, that something had not yet ended, that whatever Bellini had meant about debts older than Dante's father's grave, about things Dante didn't understand about his own family, would have to be answered before either of us could finally rest. The truth Bellini had hinted at took 3 days to surface, and when it did, it arrived through Sandro himself. He appeared at Dante's home without warning. Older than the photograph I remembered from Tomas's wallet, a new scar joining the old one above his eyebrow. His eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 2 years running from something he couldn't outrun. I will not pretend that seeing him again was simple. There was a version of myself, in that first frozen moment, that wanted to scream at him for every night I'd spent alone and frightened. Every lie his absence had forced me to tell myself just to survive the days. But there was a larger truth standing beside me with his hand at my back, and a smaller truth growing inside me who would, someday, ask about her father. And I understood that whatever happened next mattered more than my own anger. I didn't run from you, Sandro said quietly, addressing Valentina first, something genuinely broken in his voice. I ran because I discovered our father, Dante's father, our father, had made a deal with Bellini's family decades ago. One that meant Bellini believed he had a legitimate claim to half the Morty territory once our father died. I found proof. Bellini wanted me dead before I could give it to Dante. I disappeared to protect you from being caught in the middle of that, and then I was too much of a coward to come back and explain. And every month that coward grew larger until I didn't know how to face either of you. You could have told me, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. Whatever you were running from. You could have trusted me enough to tell me the truth instead of simply vanishing. I know. He looked in that moment, genuinely ashamed, not performing remorse, but carrying it. I am sorry, Valentina, for all of it. I have no excuse that makes it acceptable. Dante's hand tightened at my back. And I understood that whatever reunion occurred between the brothers would have to wait for the larger threat that remained. Bellini's surviving lieutenants, who had taken the proof of that old territorial claim and used it to rally what remained of his organization for one final, desperate assault. The battle that followed was the largest of the entire war. Bellini's remaining forces converging on Morty territory in a final, doomed attempt to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. I will not describe every detail of that night. Some violence does not deserve to be relived in careful prose. I will say only that Dante fought not as a man defending territory, but as a man defending a family that had finally, fully reassembled itself. His brother fighting beside him for the first time in 2 years, his men rallying with a loyalty that Carlo's betrayal had never managed to fully erode. Bep, against every reasonable instinct, insisted on being useful and managed through a combination of luck and genuine, if clumsy, courage to disable a getaway vehicle that would have allowed 2 of Bellini's lieutenants to escape. An act that earned him a permanent and slightly exaggerated reputation in the neighborhood as the man who stopped the war, much to his delighted and constant embarrassment. The fighting ended at dawn, with Bellini's organization finally, completely dissolved, its remaining members scattered or surrendered. The old territorial claim that had started everything finally and permanently buried. It cost Dante something real. I watched him kneel beside one of his own men, young, barely older than 20, who had died defending a territory he'd probably never fully understood the politics of, and understood that whatever triumph the morning represented, it arrived soaked through with grief that would never fully wash out. "It's over," he said finally, finding me in the gray dawn light, blood and exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "It's actually over." He was not the same man who had stood in my shop months before, watching me knead dough with an unreadable, distant stillness. Something in him had cracked open during this war, and let in light it had never previously allowed. Grief, fear, love, all of it now visible in a face that had once given away nothing at all. "It's over," I agreed and let myself finally believe it. Milan rebuilds slowly. I learned that in the weeks following Bellini's fall, watched the neighborhood exhale, watched Giuseppe's espresso orders return to their normal, unhurried rhythm. Watched the bell above my shop door ring properly again, every single time, with no silence preceding it. Sandro stayed, eventually, choosing to face the family he'd abandoned rather than continuing to run. I will not pretend the reconciliation between us was instant or simple. We spent long, careful conversations rebuilding something that would never again resemble what we'd once had, settling instead into something more honest, not lovers reunited, but 2 people who had once shared something significant, now finding their way toward a different, quieter kind of connection, mostly for the sake of the child who would, eventually, need both of them in whatever capacity they could honestly offer. Dante and I, meanwhile, built something slower and more deliberate than anything the war had demanded of us. He proposed on an ordinary Tuesday evening, in my shop after closing. With flowers still dusting the counter, and no audience beyond Bep, pretending very unconvincingly to organize the front display while actually watching everything with undisguised delight. "I don't have anything elaborate prepared," Dante said, and there was something almost shy in his voice that I'd never heard from him before, the careful control finally fully dissolved into something simpler and more honest. "I thought about doing this somewhere grand. A restaurant, a view of the city, something that matched what you deserve, but I kept coming back to this room. This is where I first understood something had changed in me. It felt wrong to ask anywhere else." "You're nervous," I said, something in my chest going warm and unsteady at the sight of it. I have never once been nervous in my life until I met a woman who refused to look up at me. He took my flour-dusted hand in both of his, careful in a way that contradicted everything about the violence I knew him capable of. "I am not offering you safety, Valentina. I learned that lesson too thoroughly this past year. I cannot promise you a life without danger, not entirely, not in this world. What I can offer is everything else. Every version of myself, the controlled one and the one that broke completely the night I thought I'd lost you. I am asking you to choose all of it, eyes open, full cost understood, the way you chose to stay once before. You already know my answer. I want to hear it anyway." "Yes," I said. And the word came out steadier and more cert than almost anything else I'd said in the past year of fear and uncertainty. "Yes, completely, eyes open." Bep, from the front of the shop, made absolutely no effort to disguise his triumphant fist pump, immediately knocking over a display of cornetti in the process. An act of clumsy joy so perfectly, ridiculously him that both Dante and I dissolved into the kind of laughter that comes only after surviving something genuinely terrible together. Nickname with full warmth, Farina, Dante said later that night, his hand resting against the now-pronounced curve of my stomach. The word emerging from him, with none of the cold observation it once carried, transformed entirely into something tender. I used to think it was simply what I saw on your hands. I understand now it was always something else. You turn the most ordinary things into something that holds an entire family together. Flour and water and patience, and somehow something whole. We did not have a fairy tale wedding. We had something better, I think, small, quiet, attended by people who had survived something significant together. Giuseppe weeping openly through the entire ceremony. Beppe serving as the most enthusiastically inappropriate best man in the history of Milan. Sandro standing slightly apart but present, genuinely present. Finally home in whatever capacity he was capable of being. That evening, sitting together in the quiet of what would become our home, Dante's hand never leaving mine, I thought about the woman who had stood kneading dough months before. Terrified and alone and pregnant, refusing to look up at a danger she couldn't yet understand. I would not change a single thing about how we arrived here, even the fear, even the cost, especially the cost. 8 months later, my daughter learned to walk in the same shop where everything began. Her small, unsteady steps carrying her between flour sacks and display cases, while Beppe cheered with the enthusiasm of a man watching an Olympic event, rather than a toddler's first wobbling attempts. At mobility, we named her Rosa, after Dante's mother, a small gesture toward a family history that had nearly destroyed itself before finally, fully healing. The bell above the shop door rang one ordinary afternoon, the way it always rang now, clean and bright, no silence preceding it, no fear attached to the sound at all. I looked up automatically, the way I'd learned to over the past year, and found Dante standing in the doorway, dressed simply, no men flanking him, no danger trailing behind his arrival. Just a husband returning to collect his family for dinner. I was kneading dough when he entered, exactly as I had been the very first day, except everything about the moment was different. The weight of the room, the warmth in his expression. The small girl who shrieked with delight and abandoned her wobbling exploration to throw herself at his legs. And I did not look up immediately. I finished the fold, pressed my palm into the dough one final time, and only then raised my eyes to meet his, watching something cross his face that I recognized instantly. Because I'd seen its earlier version once before, months and a lifetime ago. "You didn't look up," he said softly, lifting Rosa into his arms, his eyes never leaving mine. "I had bread that wouldn't proof itself. Of course you did." But this time, instead of studying me with careful, unreadable distance, he crossed the shop and pressed a kiss against my temple. His free hand finding the small of my back, with the easy familiarity of a year, spent learning every version of each other. I think I finally understand what that detail cost me, that very first day. I walked into this shop expecting fear, expecting deference, expecting the same reaction I received everywhere else in this city. Instead, I found a woman who simply continued her work. And I have spent every day since unable to stop thinking about what it would feel like to be someone you didn't need to fear. Why her moment echoes, he names what it costs him, sensory motif. Closes, there was flour on my hands. The same as that first day, the same as every day since. Except now it dusted Rosa's small fingers too, where she'd reached for the dough with the curious determination of a child who would. Undoubtedly, grow into someone who refused to be told what she could or couldn't touch. Farina, Dante said, the name now carrying nothing but the accumulated warmth of an entire shared life. Your mother makes the best bread in Milan. The best bread in Milan, I agreed. Smiling against his shoulder, as Rosa babbled something incomprehensible and delighted between us. Made by a woman who once almost hit a mafia boss with a rolling pin. I have never been more grateful for a rolling pin in my entire life. We stood together in the quiet warmth of the shop as the afternoon light slanted through the front window, the same window that had once shattered with bullets. Now simply glass, simply ordinary, holding nothing more dangerous than sunlight and the smell of rising bread. I thought in that suspended, golden moment about every version of myself the past year had demanded I become: frightened, fierce, desperate, finally, fully chosen. I thought about debt and danger and a brother who had run and finally returned, about a traitor who had found, somehow, one final moment of conscience, about a comedy relief friend who had become, somewhere along the way, genuine family rather than simple comic distraction. I thought, mostly, about flour on my hands, and a man who had once needed an entire war to understand that the bravest thing he'd ever witnessed was a woman who simply refused to stop kneading dough. This is where we end, not because the story is finished, but because some stories deserve an ending that closes gently rather than dramatically, a door shut softly rather than slammed. We built something whole from flour and patience and impossible circumstance, and whatever comes next, we will face it the way we faced everything before. Together, eyes open, full cost understood.